Margaret Davies's hands trembled as she read the letter for the third time, the words blurring through tears she hadn't shed in 25 years of prison work. The letter was addressed to her, but the name at the bottom made her heart stop. Marcus Williams, the young man she'd helped free from wrongful conviction just 6 months ago. The young man who was supposed to be building a new life, far from the concrete walls and razor wire that had stolen 4 years of his innocence. But Marcus wasn't writing from his new apartment in Baton Rouge. He was writing from a hospital bed in New Orleans, and the words on the page were devastating. "Margaret, the cancer is aggressive. Stage 4. The doctors say I have maybe 2 weeks. There's something I need to ask you, something that might sound crazy, but you're the only person I trust." Margaret set the letter down and stared out the window of her small retirement cottage in rural Louisiana. After exposing the massive prescription fraud conspiracy that had framed Marcus, after watching him walk free into the sunshine, after finally retiring from 25 years of corrections work, she thought her days of carrying other people's burdens were over. She was wrong. The letter continued, "I want to go back to David Wade Correctional Center. I know how that sounds. But there's something there I never told you about. Someone I promised to help, and I'm running out of time to keep that promise." How had they gone from the triumph of justice served to this moment of devastating urgency? How had the young man whose freedom she'd fought so hard to secure ended up asking her to help him return to the very place that had nearly destroyed him? 6 months earlier, the Louisiana heat pressed down on David Wade Correctional Center like a suffocating blanket, turning the concrete walls into ovens and the air into something thick enough to taste. Margaret Davies walked through the main corridor for what she knew would be one of her last times, her keys jangling with the familiar rhythm that had marked 25 years of her life. At 49, Margaret had survived more in America's prison system than most people could imagine. She'd broken up riots with nothing but her voice and her reputation. She'd talked suicidal inmates off ledges, both literal and metaphorical. She'd seen the worst of human nature and somehow managed to keep believing in the possibility of redemption. But David Wade was different. This wasn't just another maximum security facility, it was where careers came to die, where the state sent its most hardened criminals and its most problematic corrections officers. Margaret had been transferred here 6 months ago as punishment for refusing the sexual advances of her previous warden, and every day since had been a test of her resolve to finish her career with dignity intact. The facility housed 1,200 men whose society had largely given up on. Walking the corridors meant navigating a complex ecosystem of gangs, grudges, and unspoken rules that could turn deadly in an instant. The guards here were different too, harder, more cynical, worn down by the constant weight of containing so much concentrated desperation. Marcus Williams didn't fit any of the patterns Margaret had learned to recognize over 2.5 decades in corrections. She first noticed him during her 3rd week at David Wade, standing in the library with a book of poetry in his hands, reading with the kind of focused attention that was rare anywhere, but almost unheard of in maximum security. At 24, Marcus was tall and lean, with the kind of quiet strength that came from necessity rather than aggression. His cell was arranged with military precision, books stacked by height, a small notebook where he wrote every day, everything clean and purposeful. Most inmates wore their crimes like armor, projecting danger to survive in an environment where showing weakness could be fatal. Marcus seemed to project something else entirely: intelligence, dignity, and a kind of sadness that spoke of loss rather than anger. His file said armed robbery with a weapon enhancement. 20 years to serve, no possibility of parole for 15. But watching Marcus interact with other inmates, helping them write letters, mediating disputes with quiet authority, sharing his commissary purchases with men who had nothing, Margaret began to suspect that something about his case didn't add up. The first real conversation came during a shift change on a Tuesday evening. Margaret was walking the medication rounds when Marcus approached her with respectful directness. "Officer Davies, could I speak with you sometime? About my case, I know you probably hear this from everyone, but I need someone to listen." Listen. Margaret had heard variations of this request thousands of times. Every inmate claimed innocence. Every convict had a story about being railroaded by the system. After 25 years, she'd learned to nod politely and keep walking. But something in Marcus's voice stopped her. Maybe it was the way he phrased it, not demanding her time, not claiming persecution, just asking for someone to listen. Maybe it was the fact that in 6 weeks of observation, she'd never seen him lie, manipulate, or play the games that were second nature to most prisoners. "Storage room C," she found herself saying. "Tomorrow, 11 p.m. 5 minutes." The meeting that changed everything took place in a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Marcus sat on a supply crate, hands folded, looking somehow both older and younger than his 24 years. "I was a pharmacy technician at Baton Rouge General Hospital," he began, his voice steady and clear. 3 years on the job, clean record, studying for my PharmD at night. I loved the work, helping people, being part of something that mattered." Margaret remained standing, arms crossed, every instinct telling her to end this conversation and walk away. But Marcus continued with the kind of detail that couldn't be fabricated. "I started noticing discrepancies in the medication inventory. Powerful painkillers going missing, oxycodone, fentanyl, morphine. Not small amounts that might be explained by clerical errors, but significant quantities. Enough to supply a street operation." The story that unfolded over the next hour was one of systematic corruption that reached into every level of the hospital hierarchy. Marcus described how he'd begun documenting the thefts, tracking serial numbers, copying altered prescriptions, building a case that implicated not just orderlies or nurses, but senior physicians and hospital administrators. Dr. Patricia Summers was running the entire operation, Marcus explained, his voice growing harder. Patients dying of cancer were getting sugar pills while their real medication was sold on the street. People in excruciating pain were being told their bodies were building tolerance when the truth was their medicine was being stolen and sold. Margaret felt her skepticism wavering. The details were too specific, too technical, too emotionally consistent to be manufactured. Marcus wasn't telling her about a crime of passion or desperation. He was describing the methodical documentation of institutional evil. "I reported it through proper channels," Marcus continued. "Filed a formal complaint with hospital administration, provided evidence, and requested an investigation. 2 days later, I was arrested for robbing a pharmacy in Metairie." The frame-up, as Marcus described it, was almost perfectly executed. Security footage showed someone matching his height and build, wearing his work jacket, robbing a pharmacy during hours when Marcus should have been at work. Witnesses provided detailed descriptions that matched him exactly. His time card had been altered to show he'd left early that day. The evidence he'd collected had vanished from his apartment. My supervisor, who'd seen me at work that entire day, suddenly couldn't remember where I'd been. Coworkers who'd talked to me during the supposed robbery time developed convenient memory lapses. The prosecutor painted me as a drug addict who'd stolen medication from dying patients to feed my habit. Margaret found herself leaning forward, drawn in despite every professional instinct that screamed caution. "What happened to Dr. Summers?" Marcus's laugh was bitter and exhausted. "Promoted to chief of medicine 6 months after my conviction. The prescription theft investigation concluded that I had been the only perpetrator. Case closed, problem solved." By the time Marcus finished his story, Margaret realized she was no longer thinking like a corrections officer. She was thinking like the police detective she'd once dreamed of becoming, the investigator who'd been buried under 25 years of bureaucracy and institutional cynicism. The next 3 weeks became a carefully orchestrated investigation conducted entirely in Margaret's off hours. She started with phone calls to old contacts in law enforcement, former colleagues who'd moved into detective work, retired officers who remembered when justice mattered more than clearance rates. The patterns emerged slowly but undeniably. 7 hospitals across Louisiana had reported prescription thefts matching the methodology Marcus had described. 16 pharmacy robberies had been committed by suspects matching his description with unsettling precision. Witnesses in multiple cases had given statements that were nearly identical in language and detail. Her breakthrough came through a retired Baton Rouge detective named William Chen, who'd been forced into early retirement after asking too many questions about prescription fraud cases that kept getting buried. "You're playing with fire," Chen warned her during a clandestine meeting at a truck stop outside Monroe. "People who dig into Dr. Summers' operation tend to have accidents. Car crashes, house fires, unexpected heart attacks. Always just random enough to avoid suspicion." Chen provided Margaret with contact information for Sarah Jenkins, a former pharmacy technician who'd worked with Marcus and had fled to Texas after receiving death threats. The meeting with Sarah took place in a nearly empty diner in Shreveport, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. Sarah was 43 years old and looked like she hadn't slept peacefully in years. Her hands shook as she showed Margaret evidence that Marcus couldn't have possessed: financial records, text message screenshots, recorded phone conversations, and most damning of all, security footage from a hospital storage room showing Dr. Summers personally removing medications that were later reported stolen. "Marcus was going to expose everything," Sarah whispered, constantly checking the diner's entrance. "They couldn't discredit his evidence, so they destroyed his credibility instead. Perfect frame job. He goes to prison, the investigation dies, and everyone responsible gets promoted or relocated." The evidence Sarah provided was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Bank records showing mysterious cash deposits into Dr. Summers' accounts. Communications between hospital administrators and local police were coordinating Marcus's arrest. Even testimony from paid witnesses admitting they'd been coached on exactly what to say in court. Margaret spent 3 more weeks verifying every piece of evidence before making contact with the FBI. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed once agents realized the scope of the conspiracy. The raid on Baton Rouge General Hospital made national news. Dr. Summers was arrested along with 14 other conspirators, including 2 judges who'd been taking bribes to ensure harsh sentences for anyone who threatened the operation. Marcus's conviction was overturned in record time. Margaret was there the day he walked out of David Wade Correctional Center, Louisiana sunshine on his face for the first time in 4 years as a free man. When Marcus saw her waiting by the gate, tears streamed down his cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret had maintained her professional composure for 25 years, but watching this young man taste freedom after 4 years of wrongful imprisonment cracked something inside her chest. "You earned your freedom," she replied, but Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You gave me my life back. You believed me when no one else would. You risked everything to investigate something that wasn't your responsibility. You're the reason I'm standing here." For the first time in her career, Margaret felt like she'd truly served justice rather than just maintaining order. Marcus rebuilt his life with the determination of someone who understood how precious freedom could be. He moved to Baton Rouge, found work at an independent pharmacy whose owner believed in second chances, and began studying again for his PharmD. He called Margaret once a month to update her on his progress, and she found herself looking forward to those calls more than she cared to admit. Margaret's own retirement had been quiet and comfortable. The state had offered her a modest settlement to avoid a lawsuit over her punitive transfer, and she'd used the money to buy a small cottage in rural Louisiana. She spent her days reading, gardening, and trying to decompress from 25 years of hypervigilance. The cancer diagnosis came 6 months after Marcus's release, delivered in the sterile efficiency of a doctor's office that smelled like antiseptic and broken dreams. Stage 4 lung cancer, aggressive and inoperable. 2 to 3 weeks with treatment, maybe less without it. Marcus's call to Margaret had been brief and devastating. "I need to ask you something that's going to sound crazy, but I don't have time to find another way. I need to go back to David Wade. There's someone there I made a promise to, and I'm running out of time to keep it." Which brought Margaret back to the present moment, sitting in her cottage, reading Marcus's letter and trying to understand how the young man she'd helped free was asking her to help him return to prison. The letter explained everything. During his 4 years at David Wade, Marcus had befriended an elderly inmate named Samuel Morrison, a 72-year-old man serving life without parole for a murder he'd committed in a moment of alcohol-fueled rage 40 years ago. Samuel had spent 4 decades trying to make amends for his crime, becoming a mentor to younger inmates, mediating conflicts, and running educational programs that had prevented countless violent incidents. Samuel was also dying of the same cancer that was killing Marcus, but he had no family on the outside, no visitors, no one to help him face his final weeks with dignity. Marcus had promised Samuel that if he ever got out, he would find a way to help Samuel reconnect with the daughter who'd refused all contact for 40 years. "I tried everything," Marcus wrote. Letters, phone calls, hiring a private investigator. Samuel's daughter, Jennifer Morrison Blake, lives in Oregon now. She's a successful lawyer with a family of her own. She won't even acknowledge that her father exists. But Samuel talks about her every day. Shows pictures he's kept for decades. He's going to die alone in that place, and I promised him I'd find a way to bring her to say goodbye. The plan Marcus outlined was both simple and impossible. He wanted to return to David Wade as a volunteer chaplain's assistant, a position that would allow him to spend time with Samuel while reaching out to Jennifer one last time. Not as a stranger making cold calls, but as someone who could speak to what her father had become over 4 decades of incarceration. "I know it sounds insane," the letter concluded, "going back to the place that stole 4 years of my life. But Samuel gave me hope when I had none. He taught me that being innocent of the crime you're convicted of doesn't make you innocent of all responsibility to make the world better. I have maybe 2 weeks to keep my promise to him. Will you help me?" Margaret set down the letter and stared out at the Louisiana countryside, watching Spanish moss sway in the breeze. After 25 years of witnessing human failure and institutional indifference, after fighting so hard to expose corruption and secure justice for Marcus, the idea of helping him return to prison seemed like the cruelest possible irony. But she also understood something that Marcus had learned during his wrongful imprisonment. Sometimes the most important promises are the ones that cost you everything to keep. The next morning, Margaret made a series of phone calls that surprised even her. To the warden at David Wade, requesting a meeting about establishing a new volunteer program. To the state chaplain's office, inquiring about requirements for lay assistance. To her lawyer, asking about liability waivers and emergency medical procedures. The meeting with Warden Hayes was surreal in its civility. The same man who'd tried to coerce her into sexual favors 8 months ago now listened respectfully as she outlined a proposal for a terminal illness visitation program that would allow qualified volunteers to provide companionship for dying inmates with no family support. "This Marcus Williams," Hayes said, reviewing the application Margaret had prepared. "Isn't he the one whose case got overturned? The wrongful conviction?" Margaret nodded, waiting for the inevitable objection. Instead, Hayes surprised her. "Might be good for our image. Show that we're progressive, focused on rehabilitation and human dignity. What kind of background check does he need? Within a week, Marcus was approved as a volunteer chaplain's assistant at David Wade Correctional Center. Margaret drove him there herself, watching his face as they approached the razor wire and guard towers that had contained him for 4 years. "You sure about this?" she asked as they parked outside the visitor processing center. Marcus was pale but determined. "I've been dying since the day I was diagnosed. At least this way, the time I have left means something." Samuel Morrison looked even frilier than Marcus had described. At 72, he was a shadow of the powerful man who'd been incarcerated 4 decades ago. Cancer had reduced him to skin and bones, but his eyes still held the intelligence and kindness that had made him a respected figure among the prison population. "You came back," Samuel whispered when Marcus appeared in the hospice ward. "I thought I was hallucinating when they told me." Marcus pulled up a chair beside Samuel's bed. "I told you I'd find a way to reach Jennifer. I have news." The conversation that followed was one Margaret observed from a distance, but she could see the impact of Marcus's words on the dying man. Samuel's eyes filled with tears, his hands trembling as Marcus showed him printed emails and photographs. Jennifer Morrison Blake had finally agreed to come to Louisiana. Not because of Marcus's repeated attempts to contact her, but because of a letter from her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, who'd asked why Grandpa couldn't come to Christmas dinner like other grandpas did. "She'll be here tomorrow," Marcus told Samuel. "She wants to see you. She wants to talk. She wants to try to understand." Samuel cried then, 40 years of grief and regret pouring out in a way that would have been dangerous in the general population but was safe in the quiet dignity of the hospice ward. The reunion between Samuel and Jennifer happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the prison visiting room, with Marcus and Margaret serving as unofficial mediators. Jennifer was 45 years old, professionally successful, and terrified. Samuel was dying, desperate, and barely able to speak above a whisper. The conversation was halting at first, filled with decades of pain and mutual incomprehension. Jennifer had spent her entire adult life trying to forget that her father existed. Samuel had spent 40 years trying to find a way to apologize for destroying their family. But slowly, carefully, with Marcus facilitating communication and Margaret providing quiet support, father and daughter began to build a bridge across 4 decades of separation. Jennifer learned that her father had earned his GED, then a bachelor's degree, then a master's degree in counseling. That he'd prevented 17 suicides, mediated hundreds of violent conflicts, and mentored countless young men who'd lost their way. Samuel learned that his daughter had built a successful legal career specializing in victims' rights. That she was married to a good man who supported her decision to finally confront her past. That his granddaughter Emma was curious about family history and had been asking questions about the grandfather she'd never met. The visits continued for 10 days. Each afternoon, Jennifer would drive from her hotel to David Wade, spending hours talking with her father about everything they'd missed, everything they'd lost, everything they might still be able to salvage. Marcus grew weaker with each passing day, but he continued to facilitate the conversations between Samuel and Jennifer, serving as translator between 2 people who spoke the same language but came from different worlds. On the 10th day, Samuel Morrison died peacefully in his sleep, holding his daughter's hand. Jennifer stayed for the funeral, a simple service in the prison chapel attended by dozens of inmates whose lives Samuel had touched over 4 decades. She spoke about forgiveness, about the difference between the crime someone commits and the person they become, about the importance of believing in redemption even when it seems impossible. Marcus collapsed during the service. The cancer that had been eating away at him for weeks finally overwhelmed his body's ability to compensate. Margaret rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital in Monroe, holding his hand as paramedics worked to stabilize his breathing. In the hospital room, with machines monitoring his failing vital signs, Marcus managed one last conversation with Margaret. "Did we do the right thing?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret looked at this young man who'd spent his final weeks helping an old convict reconcile with his daughter, who'd returned voluntarily to the place that had wrongfully imprisoned him because he'd made a promise to someone who had no one else. "Yes," she said simply. "We did exactly the right thing." Marcus died 3 days later, with Margaret and Jennifer both at his bedside. His funeral was held at a small church in Baton Rouge, attended by co-workers from the pharmacy where he'd worked, fellow volunteers from the chaplain's program, and several former inmates from David Wade who'd been granted permission to attend. Jennifer Morrison Blake spoke at Marcus's funeral, describing him as the bridge that had allowed her to find her father again before it was too late. She established a foundation in Marcus's name that provided support for families trying to reconnect with incarcerated relatives, and she became a regular volunteer at David Wade, continuing the work that Marcus had started. Margaret returned to her cottage and her quiet retirement, but she carried with her a new understanding of what justice could mean. Not just the mechanical application of laws and procedures, but the more complex work of helping people find their way back to each other across the barriers that crime and punishment create. 6 months later, Margaret received a letter from Jennifer. The foundation had helped reunite 47 families, preventing countless deaths in isolation and loneliness. Samuel's story and Marcus's role in bringing about reconciliation had inspired other states to develop similar programs. "Marcus kept his promise to my father," Jennifer wrote, "but he also kept a promise I didn't know he'd made, to show me that redemption is possible even when it seems impossible. Thank you for helping him do both." Margaret folded the letter and looked out at the Louisiana countryside, where Spanish moss swayed in the breeze and the afternoon light filtered through ancient oak trees. She thought about Marcus Williams, who'd chosen to spend his final weeks in prison not because he belonged there, but because someone he cared about needed him there. She thought about Samuel Morrison, who'd spent 40 years earning the right to his daughter's forgiveness and died knowing that his granddaughter would grow up understanding that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define entire lives. And she thought about her own 25 years in corrections, which had taught her that the most important work wasn't keeping dangerous people locked up, but helping lost people find their way home. In the end, that's what justice meant, not just punishment for the guilty, but the possibility of redemption for everyone brave enough to seek it. Marcus Williams had understood that truth, and in his final act of courage, he'd shown Margaret and Jennifer Morrison Blake what it looked like to choose love over fear, forgiveness over bitterness, and hope over despair. The young man who'd been wrongfully convicted had spent his last weeks proving that innocence wasn't just about the crimes you didn't commit, it was about the good you chose to do with whatever time you had left. His last wish had been to help an old man die with dignity and a daughter discover that 40 years was never too long to start over. In fulfilling that wish, Marcus had shown everyone around him what it truly meant to be free. What did you think of Marcus's incredible sacrifice? Have you ever witnessed someone choose kindness over self-preservation, even in their final moments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about the unsung heroes in your own life. If this story of redemption and second chances touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring true stories that remind us of the power of human compassion. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. And tell us, where are you watching from? We love connecting with our global community of viewers who believe that everyone deserves a chance at redemption.